Part 2 of Chapter 11, you can see that Andrew Jackson has won very handily the electoral vote in the election of 1828 here. And so a little bit about Jackson's democratic agenda. So the first thing here is called the spoils system. And one thing you need to know about Andrew Jackson, Jackson didn't really care about putting people into office that could actually do the job. He put his friends in office. That's what's called the spoils system. He replaced competent civil servants with party loyalists. Jackson's agenda was more in line with Thomas Jefferson's vision of a limited federal government, and basically he feared that government intervention in the economy could perhaps favor some groups over others. And he opposed federal support of transportation and grants of monopolies and charters. He also supported a federal policy to remove Indians. He was free with applying the presidential veto when congressional action didn't match his views. He often got the nickname King Andrew because he used the veto pen very, very, very much in comparison with other presidents of the time. His impact on the presidency in terms of Native American policy was very simple. His Indian policy on number 1 there, in his first message to Congress in 1829, that a priority of his was to remove the thousands of Indians in the South and other areas to territory west of the Mississippi. And this was going to be the only way to save them, he said. Therefore, Congress backed his Indian Removal Act of 1830, in which the goal was to relocate Native American tribes west of the Mississippi into a new Indian territory, which is in what we call present-day Oklahoma. Indians did not go down easily here. They resisted very handily. The Black Hawk War erupted in Illinois and Wisconsin when the Sauk and Fox Indians resisted. The large southern tribes, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Cherokee, proved even more resistant to removal. In 1831, when Georgia announced its plans to seize all Cherokee property, the tribal leadership took their case to the United States Supreme Court. In a very famous Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court upheld the territorial sovereignty of the Cherokee people. President Jackson simply ignored the court and took their lands anyway. The Trail of Tears. In May 1838, federal troops arrived to remove the remaining Cherokee. Under armed guard, Cherokees embarked on a 1,200-mile journey west that became to be known as the Trail of Tears. Nearly a quarter of the Cherokees died en route from the hardship before they joined other Indians in the Indian Territory. Here's a picture of Andrew Jackson as the Great Father, being the father of all Americans, and of course saving the Native Americans from themselves. Kind of a ridiculous notion when basically all the government wanted was to take their land. Here is the Trail of Tears. This was a pretty awful thing in American history, to say the least. The real reason the government wanted all of these lands is because gold was discovered here. And not only that, having all of this land would allow cotton planters to do their thing in this land here. And so you can clearly see that in the Trail of Tears and Indian removal. Other things happening in Jackson's presidency was called the Tariff of Abominations and Nullification. On point number 1, federal tariffs. Tariffs as high as 33% on imports such as textiles and iron goods had been passed in 1816 and again in 1824 in an effort to shelter new American manufacturers from foreign competition. Now, some Southerners really opposed this, fearing they would hurt cotton exports. In 1828, Congress passed a revised tariff that became known as the Tariff of Abominations. A bundle of tariffs, some as high as 50%. South Carolina suffered greatly from this tariff. And a group of South Carolina politicians, most notably a guy named John C. Calhoun, advanced a doctrine called nullification, arguing that when Congress overstepped its powers, states had the right to nullify Congress's acts. So President Jackson wasn't going to put up with that. And so what he did is he sent armed ships into Charleston Harbor and threatened to actually invade the state to force them to actually go along with this tariff idea. And he pushed through Congress something called the Force Bill, which defined Carolina's stance as treason and authorizing military action to collect federal tariffs. Congress also passed a revised tariff more acceptable to the South. Federal authority versus states' rights. This question that is central to American political history was far from settled with Jackson's presidency here, even though South Carolina was able to try to nullify the bill. Jackson and South Carolina were fighting for control over what they felt was right in America, and this question is not going away. Jackson's other impacts on the presidency. Jackson believed that the Bank of the United States concentrated economic power in the hands of the few, and so Jackson tried to veto the charter in order to promote himself as a leader of the people rather than extend the Bank of the United States, which was, in his eyes, an example of elitism. And so in the election of 1832, Jackson's translation of the bank controversy into a language of class antagonism resonated with many Americans who felt they were on his side, or he was on their side, I should say, rather than on the side of big business. Economic boom. Unleashed and unregulated, the economy went into high gear in 1834. Entrepreneurs borrowed and invested money, and the market in Western land sales also heated up. And so the economy, as a result of this, really started to improve. There's a fight between Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was the leader of the Bank of the United States. It's just a funny picture that kind of shows, well, Jackson trying to knock off the elite power in the United States and that sort of thing. Kind of funny. Western land sales heated up after Jackson's election in 1832, as you can clearly see. Speculators came in, bought up 20 million plus acres of Western lands, readying it for settlement. It's a good thing they cleared the Native Americans out, I guess. That was sarcastic. I, of course, don't believe that it was the right thing to do to get rid of Native Americans. The market revolution transformed social and cultural life, and in American history at this point, you have separate spheres. The male sphere. Men's jobs were outside of the home, at an office or a store. That was their primary role. The female sphere was to basically be at home to create an atmosphere of intimacy, love, and safety, a refuge from the cruel and competitive world of market relations. Idealized notions of these roles took place in the 1830s, probably because of commercialization of these roles as disseminated through magazines, newspapers, and these ideals, I think, permeated American life to the point where these kinds of things were normal for men and for women. There's a nice picture of the separate spheres. It's not much different than, I guess, what we have today in some homes, where you have kind of a stay-at-home mom, a working father. It's hard to break old patterns. Education and the training of youth. Public school systems by the 1830s with the market revolution. In both North and South, you're going to have the beginning of lots of state-supported public school systems designed to produce pupils of both sexes who are able, by age 12 to 14, to read, write, and participate in the new marketplace. Institutions of higher learning. Only a very small percentage of young people attended institutions of higher learning, although numbers for both men and women increased. A concern for moralists. Changes in patterns of youth employment meant that large numbers of youngsters escaped the watchful eyes of their parents, which was a great cause of concern for moralists of the era who worried that kids were getting out of control, as kids often do when they go to college. Also, some different things are happening religiously. We have the Second Great Awakening. In the 1830s, as the economy changed and gender relations changed, you started to have revival meetings, camp meetings that attracted women and men hungry for more immediate access to spiritual peace. And church membership increased, and it doubled in the United States between 1800 to 1820, much of it among evangelical groups. The Second Great Awakening was basically an unprecedented revival of religion, evangelical religion, in the 1820s and the 1830s. And it was a great movement behind many of the reform movements of the era, which we will talk about shortly. There's a traveling revival there with Charles G. Finney, a preacher who was attempting to convert people and bring them back to Christ. And this had a tremendous impact on all of the things that, on all of these things here. The market revolution transformed social and cultural life by making alcohol an issue. You see two things here: alcohol consumption and the temperance movement. What they were trying to do is they were trying to talk about the problems that alcohol consumption made. Alcohol was blamed for all kinds of social ills, and the temperance movement, as a result of the Second Great Awakening, brought people's attention to the horrors and dangers of alcohol. And so there was a group of people that felt something needed to change. Perhaps America should make alcohol illegal. Organizing against slavery was a result of all of this as well. Early movements. The American Colonization Society, founded in 1817, aimed to promote gradual individual emancipation of slaves, followed by colonization in Africa. Northern challenges. Around 1830, northern challenges to slavery intensified. This is going in conjunction with the Second Great Awakening. For example, David Walker, a Boston printer, published an appeal to the colored citizens of the world which condemned racism, evoked the language of the Declaration of Independence, and hinted at racial violence if whites did not change their prejudiced ways. An abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, founded by William Lloyd Garrison in 1831 in Boston, demanded immediate abolition. His supporters started the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Number 4, spreading the word. Anti-slavery groups were organized in Philadelphia and New York in 1833. Soon a dozen anti-slavery newspapers and scores of anti-slavery lecturers were spreading the word and inspiring the formation of new local societies. Women played a huge role in abolition. They circulated anti-slavery petitions presented to the U.S. Congress with tens of thousands of signatures. For example, in 1837, Angelina Grimke and her older sister Sarah became anti-slavery lecturers targeting women. The cause of abolition divided the nation as no other did. The southern states were very much entrenched in slavery. The northern states, of course, were not interested in slavery. Okay, that does it for lecture 2 of chapter 11. When we come back, we will talk about politics in section 3.